Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. We appreciate your patience as FDA postponed this webinar to work through the challenges associated with doing this webinar virtually. Now that the team figured it out, we look forward to providing you with information we originally scheduled to provide you in March of this year. Also, I'm sure some of you attended a similar webinar in September 2019. Like the previous webinar, I will discuss the Kickstart service and provide updated numbers and figures with how SEND data is used as part of the Kickstart service. Jen Feldmann will then provide an update on common issues with SEND datasets seen at the agency. A newer portion of today's webinar will be the presentation on CDER SEND policy updates provided by Patty Brundage and Stephanie Leuenroth-Quinn. Now we will begin part one of this webinar, which will discuss the Kickstart service and common issues the Kickstart team has seen with SEND datasets submitted to the agency. In this portion, I will start with how SEND is used at the FDA. I will then pass it to Jen, who will discuss common SEND issues. And finally, I will wrap up with FDA communications on SEND issues. As many of you know, both SEND-IG version 3.0 and 3.1 are on the FDA Data Standards Catalog. These IGs cover CARSI, single-dose, and repeat-dose toxicity studies, as well as cardiovascular and respiratory safety pharmacology studies submitted to the FDA. SEND datasets should present non-clinical data in a consistent, predictable manner. They should also allow for reviewers to explore the study data and automate the creation of tables and graphs for use in reviews. The incorporation of SEND electronic data into the review is a process change for most in the reviewer community. This, combined with the short review timelines for many submissions seen by PharmTox reviewers, makes it difficult to fully utilize the SEND datasets for submissions. The OCS Kickstart service and resources support reviewer use of SEND electronic data. Many of you have likely seen this graphic in the past. This is an overview of the ideal non-clinical regulatory review process. Studies are completed by the sponsor and submitted to the agency using the ECTD submission process. The package goes through the ECTD validation rules. The SEND study data then goes through a set of study validation rules. The information is then loaded into FDA tools and services offered to reviewers who make regulatory decisions based on the studies sent for review. Overall, these are the number of applications containing SEND that the agency received over the past 3 calendar years. These numbers are broken out by IND, an NDA, or BLA. As you can see, there has been an exponential increase in these numbers as we have moved through each calendar year, culminating in 539 applications in 2019. Please note that this only includes studies that were single-dose, repeat-dose toxicity, or CARSI studies. Reviewers at the FDA utilize a system to support their review of the SEND datasets called JANUS Non-Clinical. Every SEND study received in an application goes through the JANUS loading process automatically. As of the end of December 2019, over 1,700 studies have been loaded. Reviewers may request a Kickstart service to help them with their application in JANUS Non-Clinical. This service consists of one-on-one SEND and JANUS Non-Clinical training, a data fitness analysis, and help with study data exploration and analysis in the system. Separately, reviewers may also receive support from the OCS service desk. Here is a graphical look at the studies and applications loaded to JANUS Non-Clinical by time period. As you can see, a significant number of studies and applications have been loaded to the system, and this has largely increased over time. After a study or studies successfully load into Janus Non-Clinical, OCS offers a Kickstart service to the Pharm Tox reviewer for that application. A pre-Kickstart training includes overviews of the SEND standard, the Non-Clinical Study Data Reviewer's Guide, or the NSDRG, the Define.xml file, and Janus Non-Clinical features generally. The Kickstart service includes a data fitness assessment with sponsor report and lets the reviewer know of any issues that will impact their use of the SEND datasets. It also shows reviewers how to explore their study data in Janus Non-Clinical and how to produce tables that can be used in review documents. The team also prepares tables for key analyses in Janus Non-Clinical. The graph on the left provides additional information on the number of applications that receive the Kickstart service in each calendar year. You can see we only provided 6 services in 2017, 29 services in 2018, and 45 services in 2019. This service increase shows that there is increased demand for the Kickstart service and how we were able to become more efficient with the service to increase the reviewers we reached. The table on the right shows the breakdown of applications by review division. As you can see, reviewers from DHOT are our main customers with a number of other divisions represented across the spectrum. Of note, the review divisions reflected in this pie graph do not reflect the offices and divisions after the recent reorganization of O&D. A revised graph with updated numbers based on this reorganization will come in future communications. This is a further breakdown of Kickstart applications that we have completed since inception. For study type, you can see the repeat dose tox studies make up the majority of Kickstart services. For species, the Kickstart team has seen studies on rats most often, with monkeys and dogs being the next most frequent species seen in studies receiving Kickstart services. For test facility locations, you can see that test facilities from the United States and Canada completed the majority of studies seen by the Kickstart service. And finally, as you can see, most of the studies the Kickstart team reviewed were completed by CROs. And now I will go a bit more in depth on the Kickstart service process itself. For those who have not received the Kickstart service or would like a Janus Non-Clinical refresher, the team provides training prior to the main Kickstart session. This pre-Kickstart training provides a general training on SEND topics, including domains, control terminology, an overview of the NSDRG, an introduction of the Define.xml file, and a general introduction to Janus Non-Clinical. For the main Kickstart service, the reviewer will receive a Kickstart data fitness assessment that provides an automated and manual review of SEND datasets and the associated NSDRG and Define.xml files. These checks include a verification of compliance with SEND standards and FDA rules and recommendations, confirming and documenting data that was not submitted, checking consistency across the study files and documents, and ensuring summarizations included in the reports may be reproduced using the SEND datasets. Any issues that affect data analysis are discussed with the reviewer, and a separate sponsor data fitness report details all issues identified. These sponsor data fitness reports are then sent out to sponsors by the review division as a way for sponsors to improve future SEND submissions. If the reviewer receives a full Kickstart service, the reviewer will receive training on Janus Non-Clinical specific to their study. This training is held during the same session as the data fitness assessment, and it is an interactive look at the best way to interact with application study data using Janus Non-Clinical. The team shows tables and graphs from key domains with findings and aligns them with the study report when possible. The team also provides outputs that may be used as part of the study review documents. The timeline of a standard Kickstart service is provided in this graphic. You may have seen a similar graphic previously. However, we have altered this graphic to illustrate the multiple work streams that go into the Kickstart service efforts. The study is loaded into Janus Non-Clinical within 24 hours of receipt to the agency. After receipt, the reviewer may then request either a full Kickstart service or data fitness only service. The data fitness only service provides a consult response and data fitness summary for each study included in the service, and this type of service is generally reserved for reviewers who previously received a Kickstart service. Alternatively, the full Kickstart service provides the data fitness service outputs along with the SEND and Janus Non-Clinical training and sample safety analysis outputs. There's a one-day difference between the two service offerings, but generally, the maximum time required to deliver any Kickstart service is 6 business days. And with that, I will turn it over to Jen, who will go over common issues we've seen with SEND datasets submitted to the agency.
Thank you, Jesse. Today, I'm going to be covering 6 areas where there have been common issues in SEND standardization that can affect FDA's use of the data. First, I'll be covering defined file naming and study naming. Next, I'll cover some issues we see in ISO 8601 formatted values. I will also cover common issues with submission of timing variables and categorical test results. I will show why it's important to include the calc-n numeric value to use in summary calculations for values outside of quantitative limits. And finally, I'll illustrate issues we see related to codes and abbreviations in the submitted SEND files. Let's start with some basics of defined file naming. Define.xml enables loading of submitted SEND data into Janus Non-Clinical. It therefore must be present in a study SEND submission. The name of the file must be Define.xml. Define is the base name of the file. XML is the file type extension. A style sheet is used to make Define.xml human readable, and therefore a style sheet should also be submitted in a SEND study submission. The name of the style sheet to submit is embedded in the Define file itself near the beginning of the file. The second bullet here shows an example of text from a Define file showing the style sheet name in red. The name of the style sheet submitted should therefore be exactly as it is in the Define.xml file. Some older style sheets reference a file called Define.css. If the style sheet file that you submit contains that file reference, you also need to submit that Define.css file. Otherwise, the Define.xml won't display properly. You can look at the style sheet file in a text editor such as Notepad to see if Define.css needs to be submitted. Newer style sheets published by CDER do not reference that CSS file. Here are some examples of incorrectly named files that have been received with SEND study submissions. We see file names with data definition instead of define, with the file extension repeated in the base file name, and with study IDs in the file name. That's what's blacked out in the last example. And we've also seen multiple Define files in the same folder. The naming of the Define file is straightforward, Define.xml, and the style sheet name is exactly as it is written in that Define file. Define.xml and the style sheet are included in the folder with the SEND datasets for a study. Here's an example of a SEND package in a submission folder. You can see Define.xml and the style sheet are included with the SEND dataset files and with the non-clinical study data reviewer's guide in the study tabulations SEND folder. My example here shows placeholders for the application, sequence, and study ID folders, and you can see that at the top of the screen. The study SEND dataset should follow the naming conventions in the SEND IG with the 2-character domain abbreviation as the base file name and .xpt as the file type extension for SAS transport files, as shown here. Moving on to study naming in the Define.xml file. This is a topic that was covered in our last SBIA webinar, but remains a common issue in SEND study submissions. Define.xml has a study name element. As described in the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide, this Define.xml study name element should be consistent with the study identifier used in the ECTD study submission. Here is the verbatim text from the TCG. This study name element in Define.xml identifies the study in the SEND files to Janus non-clinical. So when Define.xml follows the recommendations in the TCG, the reviewer has a consistent view of the study identifier between the ECTD and the study in Janus non-clinical. In close to half the studies submitted in 2019 and reviewed by the Kickstart team, the study name in Define.xml did not conform to the Technical Conformance Guide. We recognize that the identifier that the study is submitted under may not be known at the time that the SEND datasets and associated Define.xml are originally created. Define.xml may therefore need to be updated when putting together the submission package to align the study identifiers. I'll move on now to briefly discuss ISO 8601 formatted values. ISO 8601 format is used in SEND for variables that report dates and times, intervals of time, and duration of time. Certain domain variables use the ISO 8601 format, and TSVal and TXVal use the ISO 8601 format for certain parameters. The SEND IG indicates where ISO 8601 should be used. When ISO 8601 is specified for a variable or for a parameter value, use only that format. Do not use other formats, and do not use free text. Some examples of text that we have seen in ISO 8601 format includes not available and approximately 2 hours. Substitutions such as these can cause study data load failures or failures during data use. I'll now move to some common data fitness issues identified by the Kickstart team during study review. In calendar 2019, we reviewed 68 studies in 45 applications, and while there was a wide variety of issues identified in these studies, there were 4 common areas that had the potential to affect FDA use of data that I will cover today. Those are timing variables, lab categorical data, submission of the calc-n value replacement, and undefined codes and abbreviations. First, I'm going to cover 3 areas where we commonly see issues with timing variables. That is alignment of planned or nominal day with the study summary, timing relative to dose, and unscheduled tests or observations. First, the alignment of planned or nominal day for study summary. This is an area discussed in our last SBIA webinar, and the expectations of the FDA are described extensively in the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. Based on the SEND IG definitions, Visit DY in SEND IG 3.0 and NOM DY in SEND IG 3.1 are used by Janus when aligning data for summarization. Very frequently, however, we see the actual day reported as the planned or nominal day when tests or observations are scheduled by week or are scheduled with grace days. In the screenshot here, I have an example of when actual day is incorrectly reported as the nominal day. This is lab data, and I'm showing individual animal values for one group and sex, one test, but the problem occurred across all groups and all lab tests on the study. In the submitted data set, NOM-DY was set to the sample collection day. That day is shown across the top of the view. In the study report, data were summarized as a pretest baseline week -2, and then a later post-dose value treatment week 26. The pretest baseline that was summarized was collected over 3 days with different animals on different days, and then the post-dose value was collected over 2 days. Summarization of this data as submitted would give the reviewer means for a few values on each of the days of collection, rather than means for the 2 instances in the study report. To work with this data, the reviewer must identify the issue during review and merge together data from the appropriate days for analysis. Had the nominal day been correctly reported, summarization could be done without this additional work by the reviewer, keeping the focus on the scientific review and not arrangement of the data. The second example of incorrect use of visit DY and nom-DY is in the PC dataset. When sample collection is scheduled relative to dose, as it is for bioanalysis, visit DY or nominal DY should be the dose day that the sample collection times are scheduled against. In this example, samples scheduled for collection 24 hours after the day 1 dose have been reported using collection day 2 rather than dose day 1. Data for that time point is therefore reported as 24 hours after dose day 2, and that's what's shown in the Janus table for summarization and individual data results. That's the blue bar here in the center. In addition to the incorrect labeling of the data in tables, when the time concentration charts are created for dose day 1, the last time point value is omitted because it is reported in dose day 2. Now I'd like to cover some other issues we commonly see when data is collected on a schedule relative to dose. When a test or observation is scheduled relative to dose, SEND has some additional timing variables to represent that schedule, including ELTM and TPT-REF. ELTM is the amount of time relative to dose that the test or observation is scheduled for, and TPT-REF describes the dose event. We commonly see 3 issues with these variables when a test or observation is scheduled relative to dose. The first issue is that the actual day is reported rather than the planned or nominal day. This is the situation I described in the previous slide, and that affects time points 24 hours post-dose and later. The second issue that we see is that ELTM is not reported as an ISO 8601 duration format, and we've already talked about the importance of using the correct ISO 8601 formats. And the third problem we see is in TPT-REF, that the text is not specific when you have multiple doses per day or when you have dosing over an extended period, such as in timed infusion or inhalation dosing. TPT-REF and ELTM together should describe the schedule in a way that's consistent with the study design. The best way to describe the problems we see in TPT-REF is to give an example. Let's say you have 2 doses per day, and each dose is a 1-hour infusion. Your study protocol indicates that a blood sample should be collected 2 hours after the start of the first infusion on day 1 and 2 hours after the start of the last infusion on day 28. ELTM is the amount of time after the dose that the collection is scheduled for, so PT2H represents 2 hours post-dose. The common problem we see in these types of studies is that TPT-REF is something general like day 1 dose and day 28 dose. It doesn't say which dose on the day or whether the time is relative to the start or end of the dose. So if you put together ELTM and this type of generic TPT-REF in a sentence, it would read 2 hours after day 1 dose, 2 hours after day 28 dose. And you can see that that doesn't align with the description of the sampling in the protocol. In order for FDA to use TPT-REF in views, it's important that the recommendation in the SEND-IG be followed, and that's shown at the bottom of this slide. In this example, that means that TPT-REF would be something like start of first day 1 dose and start of second day 28 dose. The last common timing issue I'll cover is related to unscheduled tests and observations. Generally, unscheduled test results and observations are tabulated separate from the scheduled ones in the study report. In order to have that separation when reviewing SEND data in JANUS, the SEND-IG standard for unscheduled data must be followed. In SEND-IG 3.0, that means no visit DY value, and in SEND-IG 3.1, that means using the new unscheduled flag set to Y. Importantly, using just text labels to identify unscheduled entries is not sufficient. We commonly see the TPT variable with a notation of unscheduled data without the proper visit DY or unscheduled flag setting, as in this example. We've also seen similar notations in the SCAD variable and in the nom-label variable. These text notations can be used in addition to the correct visit DY or unscheduled flag designations, but not instead of. So that's it for the common timing issues, and I want to move on now to reporting of categorical test results in LB. Lab tests generally fall into two categories for analysis. They are either quantitative, and analysis is done with group means, or they're observational, scored, semi-quantitative, or qualitative with analysis done based on group incidence. I'll use the term categorical results for those latter types of data. SEND itself has no specific flag to say what type of data is expected for a test. That can be defined in value level metadata in Define.xml, but that's not something we consistently see done. Therefore, JANUS looks to LB*N to determine which tests have quantitative results and which have categorical results. The problem that we regularly see is that LB*N is filled for categorical results. This was discussed in last year's SBIA webinar and is also discussed in the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. I'll illustrate the problem using two examples. Here is an example of the lab incident summary showing urine protein with semi-quantitative results over 2 days. In the value column, N labels the number of animals with results. Then each of 4 scores observed on each day is shown. The value column combines LB*C and LB*U when appropriate. Even though 0.3 and 1 look like quantitative results, they are part of the scale and therefore were correctly reported with no LB*N. Thus, JANUS knows to create incidence counts for the scores on the scale. This example shows a case where LB*N was incorrectly reported. This is another set of urine protein results using a different scale. 3 different values on the scale were reported: 0, 0.1 to 0.2, and 0.3 to 0.7. The background screen shows summarization of this data, while the overlay shows the individual values for group 1. Here, 0 is incorrectly reported as a quantitative result with LB*N filled. We can see that here under the result column in the overlay screen showing the individual animal data. The values with the 2 different ranges are reported as categorical without LB*N filled. With this mix of results for a single test, JANUS has to make a guess as to the sponsor's intent, and here provides means with a notation that text values are also present. JANUS has features to allow reviewers to adapt summarization to their needs. However, as discussed previously with other issues, those adaptations take time away from the review, and when the data are correctly reported, these adaptations are unnecessary. The next common issue identified by the Kickstart team is the lack of a calc-n value in the SEND submission when a value is assigned to results above or below quantitative limits for use in analysis in the study report. This is most commonly a problem with bioanalysis data for results less than the lower limit of quantitation, and is of particular concern at time points post-treatment when some animals have results below the quantitative limit and some are above. This issue is also seen in LB for results above and below the quantitative limit. In these cases, the ability for the reviewer to reproduce the summarization in the study report can be impaired. Let's look at this example. In the background, we have the summarization for one lab test with means, standard deviations, and a notation to indicate that there are text values present. The overlay shows a drill down that looks at individual animal data for the group. You see a mix of numeric results and values less than 1.0, where 1.0 was the lower quantitative limit. In the lower corner, here are the results for the same animals from the study report, with the mean and standard deviation calculated for the group. Highlighted from that study report table is a footnote indicating that half the LLOQ was used in the summary for values less than LLOQ. No LB-CalcN value of 0.5 for these entries was supplied with SEND. So in this case, the group statistics in the summary report are not immediately reproducible by Janus. Our last topic is about undefined codes and abbreviations in SEND. In about half the studies reviewed by the Kickstart team, unexpected abbreviation codes have been included in SEND variables without definition in either the NSDRG or Define.xml. We see this in all kinds of variables: results, reasons, timing labels, findings, finding modifiers, and comments. We also see this in non-standard units and non-standard test names. Here are just a few examples of where we found undefined abbreviations and codes. As you can imagine, tracking these down and interpreting them take time away from the review. Finally, I wanted to give some good news. As Jesse noted, the Kickstart team tracks what we see in each data review so that we can look for trends. Part of that tracking is calculating a number of issues seen in each study, normalized using a number of factors so that we can make some general comparisons of the quality across different types of studies and across time. While it's a rough measure, it gives us some idea whether the quality is changing or not. This top chart shows this measure for each study assessed by the Kickstart team from February 2018 to the end of 2019. And then the lower chart is 2019 only. The red line is a trend line. So the good news is that there are fewer issues seen in more recent studies reviewed. We can also see that in 2019, there are fewer what we call tall pools, fewer studies that have many more issues than other studies. This tells me that more companies are understanding SEND and there's a more consistent approach and perhaps better overall QC. We hope to see these trends continue in 2020 so that the reviewers can use SEND with confidence in their reviews. I'll now turn this back to Jesse with a wrap-up of our Part 1 presentation.
Thank you, Jen. To wrap up the common issues with SEND datasets portion of this webinar, I would like to discuss some of the key takeaways. Over the past year, FDA has seen a significant increase in the number of studies containing SEND dataset packages. FDA farm tox reviewers are transitioning to a state where they utilize the SEND datasets alongside the study report. It is imperative that complete and correct SEND datasets are submitted by sponsors to ensure seamless, confident use of the SEND datasets by FDA reviewers. Some common issues in a SEND dataset can complicate or even at times prevent the use of SEND datasets at the agency. And finally, the FDA Kickstart team identifies issues in SEND dataset packages to effectively communicate with industry, identify trends, and help FDA reviewers maximize the use of their SEND dataset packages. I would also like to let the audience know how the agency communicates SEND-related information in addition to this webinar. Members of the CDER Send team respond to some Send-related questions sent to eData. We also provide updates to the Technical Conformance Guide and FDA business rules. As mentioned previously, the Kickstart team shares study data fitness reports to sponsors for those studies that receive a Kickstart service. FDA also presents papers and posters at FUSE events, such as the US Connect and the CSS. And finally, we offer feedback through CDIS collaborations, such as the face-to-face. And with that, I will pass this webinar over to Patty Brundage, who will begin the CDER Send policy portion of this webinar.
Thank you, Jesse. For the second portion of today's webinar, Stephanie Leuenroth-Quinn and I are going to address some common questions about Send submissions to the Office of New Drugs within CDER to help you better understand CDER's Send policies. Over the past year or so, CDER has received numerous questions from industry about Send submissions to the FDA at conferences and through the eData mailbox. Today we'd like to discuss the responses to some of these commonly asked questions to help facilitate a better understanding of CDER's Send requirements for non-clinical submissions. I will start off today addressing some of the most common Send-related questions, and Stephanie will follow up with a discussion of the differences between CDER's requirement for Send and the technical rejection criteria, as well as a discussion about the use of the simplified TS.xpt file. The eData mailbox is a valuable resource where industry can submit all their electronic data standards questions. The CDER Send team, which was formed back in 2018, assists both eData and the review divisions with all Send-related questions. The goal of this team, which is composed of members from multiple offices and disciplines within CDER, is to provide consistent responses to these Send-related questions that the team is also tracking. And today, I will address 7 of the most common Send submission questions that have been addressed by the team. By far, one of the most frequently asked questions is whether Send datasets are required when submitting a draft study report. And while the FDA understands the need to submit draft study reports, Send datasets are required when submitting these reports, as the Send datasets are integral to the review of the study for making regulatory decisions regarding non-clinical support for clinical development. Another frequently asked question is regarding the Send requirement for safety pharmacology data that are modeled in the Send Implementation Guide, or Send-IG, version 3.1. For studies initiated after March 15, 2019 for NDAs and BLAs, or after March 15, 2020 for commercial INDs, Send datasets are required for in vivo cardiovascular and respiratory test results collected during safety pharmacology studies or other study types modeled in the Send-IG version 3.1. It's important to note that Send datasets are required for cardiovascular and respiratory safety pharmacology studies, even though the technical rejection criteria presently does not apply to the ECTD module for safety pharmacology studies. The technical rejection criteria is there to ensure compliance with the Send requirement. However, it is not what dictates the requirement itself. Stephanie will go more into depth on this later. We also received questions regarding FDA support for the Send Implementation Guide for Developmental and Reproductive Toxicology, or SEND-IG-DART for short, that models embryo-fetal development studies. Although published by CDER in 2017, the SEND-IG-DART is currently not on the FDA Study Data Standards Catalog, and SEND datasets are presently not required for embryo-fetal development studies. For any new study standard, such as the SEND-IG-DART, the FDA will publish a Federal Register notice announcing FDA support for the standard and its placement on the FDA Study Data Standards Catalog. And the new study standards will be required for those studies modeled in the new IG on the catalog no less than 24 months after the publication of the Federal Register notice. Another related question is whether SEND datasets are required for juvenile animal studies. Dedicated juvenile animal studies submitted within the ECTD module 4.2.3.5.4 are considered out of scope for the SEND Implementation Guide or SEND-IG version 3.0 and 3.1, which lack the necessary domains and variables to standardize certain data and phases for dedicated juvenile animal studies. However, SEND datasets are required for repeat dose toxicology studies in juvenile animals as reflected by the age of the animal at the initiation of the study. For these repeat dose studies in juvenile animals, we do not expect reproductive endpoints or multiple phases typically included in dedicated juvenile animal studies to be included in the SEND datasets, and would only expect data on the standard endpoints modeled in the SEND-IG version 3.0 or 3.1 for animals that were treated during the dosing phase. There have also been several inquiries about whether the FDA is requiring datasets for animal rule studies. And I'm happy to say that on March 15, 2020, a Federal Register notice was published announcing FDA support for the SDTM version 1.8 and the SEND-IG for Animal Rule version 1.0 and their placement on the FDA Study Data Standards Catalog. These new standards will be required in submissions to the FDA effective March 15, 2022. Another common question is regarding the use of the Study Data Standardization Plan, or the SDSP. The SDSP is a document submitted during development to communicate the intent to submit SEND datasets for completed, ongoing, and/or planned non-clinical studies modeled in the SEND Implementation Guide version 3.0 and 3.1. The SDSP allows the Review Division to identify any potential data standardization issues and permits a timely discussion about any issues with the sponsor. This document is ideally submitted early in development, such as during the pre-IND or the opening of the IND, but it can also be updated as clinical development progresses, and it is thought that additional feedback from the agency is needed. Sponsors may also use this document to communicate their intent to use the simplified TS.xpt files for those studies and submissions within the ECTD modules checked by the technical rejection criteria. Additional information on the SDSP and its use can be found in the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. The last question I will address is whether SEND datasets are required for non-GLP studies. And before addressing the response to this question, I would first like to discuss the broad scope of non-GLP studies that we receive at the FDA, which can vary in content, study design, and purpose. At one end of the spectrum, there are exploratory studies with no control groups and very few endpoints evaluated. Then there are non-GLP studies with a few animals per dose group and multiple endpoints conducted to provide information for higher dosing. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are well-designed toxicity studies evaluating all the standard endpoints with study reports up to 2,000 pages in length. So as you can see, not all non-GLP studies are the same. Having said that, SEND does facilitate the review process for all studies, and presently SEND's datasets are required for both non-GLP and GLP studies that are modeled in the SEND Implementation Guide version 3.0 and 3.1. CDER is currently evaluating if there are certain non-GLP studies that could be excluded from the requirement, and any future decision on this will be communicated in the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. Now I will turn it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Patty. I'm Stephanie Leuenroth-Quinn, and today what I'm going to talk about are the SEND requirements versus the technical rejection criteria. I'll also spend a few slides going over the simplified TS.xpt file. But before we get into those details, I just wanted to spend a moment to make sure that everyone would understand where the requirements for standardized study data come from. Well, this originates from 745A. There was a binding guidance that was published back in December of 2014. And this guidance states the FDA policy on the requirements for submission of standardized study data. And then the FDA Data Standards Catalog will list the data standards that are supported and required by FDA in electronic submissions. And the Data Standards Catalog is updated as needed. And then to support the SEND requirements and electronic study data requirements, the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide is an additional document that further describes how industry should submit standardized study data to NDAs, BLAs, commercial INDs, as well as ANDAs. And this document is updated twice per year. So where are we right now in terms of the electronic study data requirements for SEND within CDER and OND? So as listed on this table shown here, currently there are SEND requirements for the study types including single dose toxicity, repeat dose toxicity, carcinogenicity, and more recently the cardiovascular and respiratory safety pharmacology studies. Now, please note that there are differences in the study initiation dates and the SEND-IG versions that are supported based on those dates. And of course, these will vary depending on whether that submission is for an NDA or a BLA versus for a commercial IND. So what I want to do is to spend a few minutes kind of walking through an example. Let's say you're a sponsor and you are submitting a variety of different studies to an IND. And so you have all of these different non-clinical studies. What do you need to consider in terms of SEND requirements, ECTD structure, and within the future, the technical rejection criteria? So first, let's say that you have two different safety pharmacology studies. One is for the central nervous system, and one is a cardiovascular safety pharmacology study. Let's say both were started on the same date, which was March 19th of 2020. So the first question is, do these studies require SEND? Well, based on the FDA Data Standards Catalog, this is where you get your answer. So basically, that cardiovascular safety pharm study would require SEND, but the central nervous system safety pharmacology, as it is not modeled in a supported SEND-IG, would not require SEND. So that's the first question. Then moving on, well, where do you submit those two studies within ECTD folder structure? Now, that hasn't changed. That is going to be within the safety pharmacology folder, so folder 4.2.1.3. And then the last question is, well, if I'm going to place these two studies within that ECTD folder structure, will the technical rejection criteria check it when it is activated? And the answer there is no. Now, a first word about the technical rejection criteria. It is not yet active, and I do not have a date to tell you for when that will become active at this point. But simply that when it is initially activated, that safety pharmacology folder will not be checked by the technical rejection criteria. Now let's say in addition to the safety pharm studies, you have toxicity studies. So you have a 1-month rat and a 1-month dog study. Now that rat toxicity study was initiated back in 2015, so therefore it does not require send. But the 1-month dog toxicity study initiated in May of 2019 does require send. And again, the next question is, well, where do I place this within ECTD structure? And since they are both repeat dose toxicity studies, they belong in module 4232. And the last question is, well, will the technical rejection criteria check that particular folder? And the answer there is yes. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that you need to consider the use of the simplified TS.xpt file when that's appropriate. Now, it happens to be appropriate for that 1-month rat toxicity study. So even though that study was initiated back in 2015, we need an automated way to figure out what that study initiation date was. So again, the point here is that if a particular folder will be checked by the technical rejection criteria, then you must also consider the use of the simplified TS.xpt file. And as the final example for this hypothetical submission, let's say you had a rat fertility and early embryonic development study initiated in 2015. Well, that does not at this time require send. You would place that in the normal folder structure, so module 4.2.3.5.1. And no, the technical rejection criteria will not check this folder when it is initially activated. So an additional word about the technical rejection criteria. Well, what is it? It will be in place to enforce the send requirements. This is an automated validation process. It is being added onto the existing ECTD validation criteria, again, to enforce compliance with send requirements. Again, it's only for those study types that are modeled in an FDA-supported send implementation guide. And industry will be given a 90-day notice prior to the activation of the technical rejection criteria, and I don't have that date for you yet. So again, for non-clinical studies, the technical rejection criteria will only apply to ECTD modules 4.2.3.1, 4232, and 4234 when it is initially activated. So again, I want to separate out send requirements versus the technical rejection criteria. So an important point here is that send requirement timelines are completely separate from the technical rejection criteria activation and implementation timelines. Send requirements are dictated by the FDA Data Standards Catalog. The technical rejection criteria is our internal system for study validation. So case in point, we currently have send requirements in place right now, and we have the expectation that send will be submitted for those studies. However, the technical rejection criteria is not yet active. So again, when thinking about this process, when you are submitting studies to various modules, you first must consider, does that study require send? And again, that is based on the FDA Data Standards Catalog. Next is, where does that study go in terms of ECTD format? And finally, will the technical rejection criteria check that particular module when it is initially activated? And if so, and if that study does not require send, then you need to create a simplified TS.xpt file. So again, to kind of drive this point home, so thinking about submission of your studies to the appropriate ECTD modules. So let me take this one example as outlined here, and we've seen this actual example many times. So let's say you have a rat juvenile animal toxicity study. The study tagging file is a preclinical study report. And as we heard earlier from Patty, at this time, there is no send requirement for dedicated juvenile animal toxicity studies. And again, that's based on the FDA Data Standards Catalog. Now, the appropriate placement of this study would be into Module 42354, which is named Studies in which the offspring, or juvenile animals, are dosed and or further evaluated. This is the correct ECTD folder to place this study report into. It will not currently be checked by the technical rejection criteria when activated, and you don't need to include a simplified TS.xpt file. However, what we've seen in a lot of these cases with these dedicated juvenile animal toxicity studies is that they're being placed into Module 4232, or the repeat dose toxicity study. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's the incorrect ECTD folder structure for this study type. And as a result, if that study report is placed into Module 4232, it would be subject to the technical rejection criteria validation. And if a simplified TS.xpt file was not included, it would not be accepted at the electronic gateway. So there are implications of putting a study report in an incorrect ECTD module. So again, just keep that in mind, and if you have further questions, you can refer to ICH M2 or M4 for further information on ECTD structure. So next I want to turn to using the simplified TS.xpt file. So again, I want to begin with an example. So let's say you are submitting a variety of different non-clinical studies to an IND. And let's say you have multiple studies that will be submitted into Module 4232, or repeat dose toxicity. And you have already determined that 3 of these studies require send, and a variety of other study reports don't require send. So then the question is, well, what are these other studies that don't require send? Now, a few examples. As one I've mentioned previously, let's say you have a 14-day rat toxicity study, and that was initiated back in October of 2016. So by the study initiation date requirements, send is not required for that study. So that would need a simplified TS.xpt file. Another example might be a text-based document. So perhaps you have an expert pathologist report. It's correctly placed into Module 4232, but there is no study initiation date. But you would also need a simplified TS.xpt file for this report. And we see a lot of these, and they're also text-based documents. They could be draft study protocols. So perhaps a sponsor wants feedback on a study protocol for, let's say, a chronic toxicity study. And again, that's placed in the correct module. But again, it's a text-based document, so a simplified TS.xpt file would be needed. So to keep in mind, you're sharing the space of a module that is being or that will be checked by the technical rejection criteria. And within this space, you have those studies that require send and those study reports that don't require send for a variety of reasons. So how will the technical rejection criteria identify studies that don't require send? Now, let's take the simple example. You have your 28-day rat toxicity study. It was initiated back in 2018. That requires send, and you will have a full TS.xpt file. Now that's no problem. We can pull out that study initiation date from that full TS, and we will know that that study requires send, and that full send data sets will be attached to that study report. But now you have a 28-day rat toxicity study that was initiated back in 2015. Send is not required because that study start date was prior to the requirement, but we still need to have additional machine readable information to tell us what's that study start date. because right now the study initiation date is within a PDF document. We can't open that up in some automated process to find that information. So again, that's why we need additional information with those studies. And in the other example, if you have a text-based document, so for example, that expert pathologist report, you don't have a study start date, and it simply does not apply. But again, we need a little bit more machine-readable information to tell us that point. Now that's where the simplified TS.xpt file comes in. And there's further explanation in the study data TCG around creation of the simplified TS.xpt file, as well as the technical rejection criteria for study data. So just to compare and contrast the full and simplified TS.xpt files. Now the full TS file will accompany the full SEND dataset. It follows the published CDISC standard, whereas the simplified TS.xpt file is only used when SEND datasets are not required for submissions to Module 4231, 32, and 34 when the technical rejection criteria will be initially activated. And again, part of the validation logic here is that also these studies would have a study tagging file of preclinical study report, legacy clinical study report, or study report body. So when a simplified TS.xpt file is needed, what are we asking for? It's really only a little bit more information. So we would need a study ID, we would need the TS PARM code, and we would need the study start date for when there is a valid study start date. Now in the case of a text-based document, again, we would need that study ID, the TS PARM code, and within the TS val and F field, simply put NA or not applicable and leave that study start date blank, or the TS val field blank. And as a reminder, if a full TS.xpt file is submitted, a simplified TS.xpt is not needed. So as a further note about the simplified TS.xpt file, although the technical rejection criteria is not yet active, the agency certainly encourages the use and creation of simplified TS.xpt files prior to the activation of the TRC. So again, the initial TRC activation will only include modules 4231, 32, and 34 for single dose toxicity, repeat dose toxicity, and carcinogenicity. And just as a note, if sponsors want to submit a simplified TS.xpt file with safety pharmacology studies into module 4213, and this could be to accommodate any internal practices or processes, it will not interfere with the submission. So it will not be rejected if you want to follow this practice. But again, as a reminder, upon initial activation, Module 4213 will not be subject to the technical rejection criteria. And as a final reminder, there are additional resources for you. So the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide will provide additional information on the technical rejection criteria and the non-clinical use of the simplified TS.xpt file. And this information can be found under section 8.2.2 or support on data validation rules. And as a final note, I just wanted to provide everyone with a variety of resources. So certainly if you have specific questions about submitting study data, you can please submit them to the email address edata@fda.hhs.gov. I've also listed a variety of different resources for you on the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide, the Technical Rejection Criteria, ECTD format, the Standardized Study Data Guidance, as well as I've listed a couple of webinars that were held last fall regarding these topics. So that concludes the SBIA presentations. We are going to take a quick break to review all of the questions that have been submitted. And if you give us just a few minutes, we will come back and begin answering them. So thank you all for your attention.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your time today. We have a few questions to address, so I'm going to go first. The first question is, can reviewers use send datasets without requesting the Kickstart service? So the answer to this is yes. Since send dataset packages submitted to the agency are automatically loaded into JS Non-Clinical, reviewers may utilize the send datasets in JS Non-Clinical to support their review without requesting a Kickstart service. The second question is, can reviewers receive Kickstart services for send datasets submitted to INDs as well as NDAs? And if so, do these include data fitness assessments that are sent to the sponsors? So the answer is yes. Reviewers are able to request Kickstart services, including the pre-Kickstart training for studies in INDs and NDAs or BLAs. And for both INDs and NDAs or BLAs, data fitness summaries are sent back to the sponsor for review. Third question is, can we assume if we do not receive a notification from the FDA of issues with a send dataset package, then it is acceptable as submitted? So not necessarily. A sponsor will be notified of issues with send dataset packages in two cases. So the first is if the study fails to load into JANUS Non-Clinical, the review team will send a notification to the sponsor to let them know this and request that they fix the issue identified. And a second instance would be when a sponsor will receive a data fitness summary for their study if it receives a Kickstart service. So if it did not fail to load into JANUS Non-Clinical and did not receive a Kickstart service, there may be issues not identified with the submitted send dataset packages. So I'm going to pass it over to Jen, who will answer a few more questions.
Okay. All right, so the first question I have is related to the Define.xml study naming slide. And the question is it acceptable to name the, I'm sorry, there was a correction. Is it acceptable to reference the value in TS.xpt ID in the define file as the study name? Okay, so if the study is submitted in the ECTD under the sponsor reference ID for the study, that's in the TS parameter SPREF ID, then it's fine to put the SPREF ID value in the define file. But your key thing is that you're matching up the study name in the define file with your ECTD, whether that's the sponsor reference study ID, whether that's the study ID in the send data set, whatever that is, it needs to be matching up with the ECTD. So go back to the technical conformance guide, that discussion, and that explains specifically the two matching portions from the Define.xml and the ECTD. The second question. Are abbreviations such as EOI and SOI, end of infusion, start of infusion, acceptable in TPT-REF as long as the definition is decoded in the define file or the NSDRG? Generally speaking, if you're going to include any abbreviations in the send dataset, such as SOI or EOI, to indicate whether it's start or end of an infusion, in TPT-REF, you do need to include the definition in the define file or the NSDRG. The slide that I had included regarding abbreviations were the many cases where we don't see any definitions at all, and in addition that those abbreviations are ambiguous. So yes, as long as you do have a definition for SOI and EOI, and they are quite common, and would align with your study report, it is appropriate to include the definitions in the NSDRG or in the Define file. And the third, when unscheduled data are reported mixed in with all the other data instead of in a separate report table, is it still desired to see the unscheduled flag or null visit DY in the data sets? The question seems to me to be asking whether you can submit something that doesn't follow the standard for unscheduled data. And what we're looking for in the submissions is that the data comes in following the standard for unscheduled data, and that is that visit DY is blank or the unscheduled flag is Y, depending on the version that you are submitting, version of the send IG that you're submitting under. And I think now I will pass over to some comments for Patty Brundage.
Hello. So there was a question that came in about submitting a final report after submitting an initial draft study report and how to do that. So if there are any changes to the send datasets requiring resubmission with the final report, you would resubmit the updated datasets using the replace operator. And information about using the replace operator to update send datasets can be found in section 7.1 of the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. And now I will turn it over to Stephanie.
So I have a few questions that I would like to give answers to. So the first one, there are actually several questions. I think there's a bit of confusion around the safety pharmacology studies and module 4.2.1.3 and the use of the simplified TS.xpt file. So let me just give a few examples to hopefully clarify this. So in the case where, so let's consider three scenarios for the safety pharmacology modules. So if you had, let's say, a cardiovascular or respiratory safety pharmacology study that was started after the implementation date, it is therefore modeled in SEND. So in that case, you simply submit the full SEND data set, and that's it. No need for a simplified TS. In the second scenario, let's say you have a study such as a CNS safety pharmacology study that is not modeled in a current supported SEND IG. In that case, because it's being submitted to module 4.2.1.3, and that gets to the point of, well, is that going to be checked by the technical rejection criteria, again, once it's activated or when it's initially activated? You don't need to submit a simplified TS.xpt file at this time, simply because the technical rejection criteria will not check that folder. So similarly, even if you had a cardiovascular or respiratory safety pharmacology study that was submitted and initiated prior to that implementation date, again, you don't need to submit a simplified TS.xpt file at this time, again, because the technical rejection criteria, once it is activated, will not check folder 4.2.1.3. If that were to change at some point in the future, you will certainly be notified about that. But again, when initially the technical rejection criteria will be activated, it is not going to affect the safety pharmacology module, so you do not need to submit a simplified TS.xpt file. With that said, if you do submit a simplified TS, it won't interfere with accepting that study report. So I hope that clarifies the issue around safety pharmacology studies. So the second question gets to the module for carcinogenicity, so 4.2.3.4. So the question really is, well, what if you have a literature report that is supporting the safety surrounding carcinogenicity? So do you need a simplified TS.xpt file with that? And the answer there is yes. So if you were to submit a literature reference into the carcinogenicity module 4234, you would require a simplified TS.xpt file. And the reason for that is simply because, again, once the technical rejection criteria is activated, it will be looking at all of the studies within that module. So if it simply doesn't have a study initiation date, it doesn't apply to send requirements because it is a literature report, we still need that simplified TS to tell us that a study initiation date is not applicable. And then the third question, again, is surrounding the technical rejection criteria prior to its activation. So the question really is, do you need right now a simplified TS.xpt file when the technical rejection criteria is not yet active? So what I would like to say about that is that we certainly encourage the use of the simplified TS.xpt file right now. We encourage everyone to use this. And the reason I say that, even though the technical rejection criteria is not yet active, is simply because we want to internally look at this, and we want to ensure that industry understands, how to use this process. Are we making this clear? Is further instruction needed around this? So, so again, I would encourage as much as possible the use of simplified TS.xpt files, now as well as in the future. So with that, I believe we are just going to look through a few more questions, and we will start the answer period again in just a minute.
Okay, there is one additional question that came in that I will cover. The question is, when categorical scales include units for the test, are the units expected in ORESU, STRESU, or is the decode information sufficient? Right, so presumably that when we're mentioning the decode information, that is information on the Define.xml decodes for the scale in a code list, or perhaps that could also mean the scale is presented in the NSDRG. But in either case, really, when the values on a scale include units, the results in the data set should include the units when the result is a value on the scale, so that the results themselves are unambiguous when looked at independently. So, for example, if the scale has 0, 5, 10, 15, each of those items has a unit on the scale, let's say milligram. If you only put 5 in the data set without any unit whatsoever, it is possible to go back to the scale and find out what that unit is, but to make the review straightforward and also to follow the implementation guide, you would include the unit in the data set as well. Okay, it looks like Patty has some questions that she can address as well, so I'll pass to her.
Thank you, Jen. So we had a question about the submission of SEND data sets with an audited draft report to an IND. And if the audited draft study report is for a study that was initiated after the SEND requirement date and is being submitted to support clinical development, it would require SEND data sets. And I also wanted to follow up to the previous question about the submission of SEND data sets with draft reports and then resubmitting them for final study reports. So if your SEND data set does not have any changes, you would not need to resubmit the SEND data set with the final report. You could just submit the final study report. And that, again, that is if there were no changes to the data set between the time it was submitted with the draft report and then resubmitted with the when the final report was completed. And that is all for me.
Thank you to all of our presenters for your very informative and timely talk, and also for the responding to the questions that came in. A few closing reminders: this activity is eligible for an attendance certificate which supports continuing education by SOCA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please refer to our website at FDA.gov/CDER-SBIA for more details. You'll be able to obtain the attendance certificate only upon completion of a survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks. That means it closes June 29th. Let us know your comments and feedback via the survey. This will provide us with ideas for future improvements. On behalf of CDER Small Business and Industry Assistance, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation and found it helpful. We look forward to your presence at future webinars, which will be advertised on our website at FDA.gov/CDER-SBIA webinars. Thank you.